Today, we're diving into a piece of legislation that literally changed the course of history, the Regulating Act of 1773. Now, this wasn't just some dusty old law. It was the exact moment a private company's territory began its transformation into a formal empire. So let's break down how it all went down. I mean, you've got to ask yourself, how does something like this even happen? The East India Company had become a complete global anomaly, a private corporation that was acting like its own country. But by the 1770s, its power was so mismanaged and its officials were so corrupt that the British government was basically forced to step in and intervene. Before we really unpack the act itself, we need to understand the reality on the ground in India. You see, the East India Company had long stopped being just a trading firm. By the middle of the 18th century, it had become the dominant political and military power across huge parts of the subcontinent. Just try to wrap your head around the sheer scale of the company's power. This was a business, a commercial enterprise that was controlling national-level revenue, commanding its own massive private army, and administering justice over millions of people. But this wild, unprecedented status came with virtually no oversight, which, as you can imagine, led directly to rampant corruption among its employees. So back in London, Parliament is getting all these reports of chaos. And to top it all off, the company is on the verge of bankruptcy. They knew they had to do something. Their answer was the Regulating Act of 1773, a landmark piece of legislation that would fundamentally change the relationship between Britain and India forever. And you know, the key is right there in the name, regulating. This was the very first time the British government took a formal legislative step to assert control. It was a clear admission that the company had grown way beyond a private business and was now a matter of national and imperial importance. The Act's importance can really be broken down into three key things. First, it established government control. Second, it legally recognized that the company had political and administrative functions, separating them from just simple commerce. And third, in doing all that, it laid the very groundwork for a future centralized British administration in India. So, how did the Act actually try to fix all these problems? Well, it targeted the corruption and the total lack of accountability head-on, with a whole series of new rules designed to bring the company's employees back in line. Let's break this down. First, it explicitly forbade company servants from doing their own private trading, which had been a massive source of personal wealth for them. Second, it banned them from accepting presents. Let's be real, we're talking about bribes, from locals. And finally, it forced the company's leadership back in London to report to the British government on all its revenue, civil, and military affairs. Suddenly, transparency was mandatory. This really represents the fundamental shift the Act was trying to force. The goal was to transform the very identity of a company employee, from a private trader just chasing personal wealth to a public administrator who is governing on behalf of a higher authority. Now, the 1773 Act wasn't a silver bullet, not at all. In fact, it had a number of flaws that became obvious pretty quickly. But what it did do was start a process of reform that was irreversible. It basically opened the floodgates for more and more government intervention. And just look at how quickly the next laws followed. To fix the original Act's flaws, Parliament passed an amending act in 1781. And then just 3 years later came an even more significant piece of legislation, Pitt's India Act, which took government control to a whole new level. Pitt's India Act of 1784 introduced a pretty radical new structure. To finally solve the problem of mixing commerce and governance, it created what became known as a system of double government. So here's how it worked. The company's court of directors could keep managing the business side of things, but all the political functions, civil, military, and revenue, were now going to be managed by a new government-appointed body, the Board of Control. This gave the British government supreme power to supervise and direct everything that was happening in India. The combined effect of these acts was just profound. It wasn't just about new rules for a company anymore. It was about defining a whole new reality for the territories that the company controlled. This quote, it just says it all. What an incredible shift in language and in law. Before this, the lands were company territory. After Pitt's India Act, they were officially for the very first time called British possessions. You could say the mask was well and truly off. This period of reform really led to two massive outcomes. First, the territory was now officially British. And second, the government in London, not some corporate boardroom, had the final say. The process that began with the Regulating Act was reaching its logical conclusion: total state control. And that is the ultimate legacy. The year 1773 marks the beginning of the end for company rule. It set in motion an 85-year process of the British state slowly, piece by piece, absorbing the company's functions, which all culminated in the formal takeover by the Crown in 1858.
Which leaves us with a final thought. Was this act simply a good governance measure to rein in a powerful corporation that had gone completely off the rails? Or was it something more? Was it the moment the British state created the legal and administrative blueprint it would then use to build its empire in India? The answer, as is so often the case in history, is probably a bit of both.